Hello and welcome back to another video. In today's video, we'll be discussing natural selection. We'll talk about what natural selection is and how it acts on populations of organisms. Before we get started talking about natural selection, let's do a quick review or understanding check of some important concepts and key terms that you'll need in order to understand natural selection. So first, you should remember from our previous video that a variation is a trait that is different within members of the same species. This means that there are individuals in the species that have different versions of a trait. This could be like dark fur versus light fur, or large leaves on a plant versus small leaves. You should also recall from our genetics unit that variation comes from the genetic makeup of organisms. So if there are different traits or variation within a population, this means that there's also a variation of genes within that population, meaning that different members of that population possess different versions of the same gene, called alleles. You should also recall that adaptations are traits which help an organism to survive and reproduce in their environment. This means that it is a variation of a trait that is helpful to the organism's ability to survive and to reproduce in the environment in which they live. Some adaptations are specific to survival, meaning they make it easier for that individual to survive in their environment. This also means if they stay alive, they're more likely to reproduce and pass their genes and traits on to the next generation. Some other adaptations are traits that are specific to reproduction. These are like traits that attract mates and increase reproduction or breeding, or mating behaviors that also increase the chances of that organism to reproduce. You saw some examples of specific adaptations in organisms in our previous video. Now let's get started talking about natural selection. Natural selection is the process by which species adapt over time, with individuals that are better adapted to their environment being more likely to survive and reproduce than those that are less adapted to their environment. You may have heard survival of the fittest in the past. This is a simple way of describing natural selection, meaning that those that are most fit or best adapted to their environment are going to survive and reproduce, whereas those that are not well adapted to their environment are much less likely to survive and reproduce and pass their genes on. We also know that natural selection is the process that allows species to adapt over time. This happens because the traits or adaptations which support survival and reproduction are passed on throughout generations and eventually increase or become more common within that population. Natural selection also makes it so that traits that don't support survival and reproduction will decrease within a population and over time become less common within that population. Over the course of time, normally tens of thousands to millions of years, this leads to the adaptation of a species, meaning that species becoming better adapted to whatever environment they live in. To talk about the rest of our discussion of natural selection, we're going to use an example organism, which is called the deer mouse. The deer mouse is a species of mouse that lives in the northern United States. We're going to be talking about a specific population of deer mouse today that live in Nebraska because it shows us a very clear model of natural selection taking place. Deer mouse, as you can see in the picture, have variation in their fur color gene. This means that some deer mouse are born dark brown and others are born a light sandy brown. Remember, this is based on the genetics that they receive from their parents. About 10,000 years ago, glaciers melted and deposited sand dunes across parts of Nebraska that in the past had been forest covered in dark soil. Taking this information, let's find out how natural selection has acted on the population of deer mouse over about the last 8 to 10,000 years. Natural selection takes place following this process. First, there needs to be an environmental change. So in the case of the deer mouse, the environmental change was the depositing of the sand across the previously dark forest, changing their environment from a dark colored environment to now a light sandy colored environment. The next step of natural selection is where natural selection selects the individuals that are better adapted to their environment and causes them to survive and reproduce. We call this being selected for. So this is the trait that natural selection is, so to speak, choosing because it makes the organism better adapted to their environment and more likely to survive and pass their genes on. Natural selection also allows those individuals that are less adapted to their environment to be less likely to survive and reproduce. This means that this trait is being selected against, and this trait is less likely to be passed on to following generations. Over time, this means that those individuals with that trait that was better adapted to the environment pass their genes on more often, causing that trait to become more common and increase within that population. It also means that the trait that is less adapted to the environment becomes less common within the population, eventually leading to adaptation of the species. So as the process of natural selection takes place, it acts on these traits, selecting for the traits that are adapted to the environment and against those that are not. Eventually, over the course of thousands, or more often millions of years, this leads to the entire species adapting, with more individuals in the species possessing the trait that makes them better adapted to their environment. In the case of the deer mouse, we see a very, very clear model of this happening over a relatively short period of time of about 8 to 10,000 years. As we discussed, an environmental change took place when those glaciers melted and deposited sand over the previously dark forest beds. This made the previously dark fur trait now less appropriate for the environment, making the dark mice less adapted to their environment and the light mice better adapted to their environment. This meant that over time, the dark fur trait distribution within that population would decrease, as we can see here, because these individuals were no longer well adapted to their environment. On the other hand, this made the light fur an adaptation, or a trait that made the light mouse more likely to survive and reproduce. Over the course of time, this caused the light fur trait to increase within the population. Over time, this led to the adaptation of the deer mouse. So now, if we look at the deer mouse population in Nebraska, we will find that almost all deer mice are a light sandy color, and seeing a dark fur deer mice is actually very rare. This is a model of how natural selection acts and causes a species to adapt over time. One other case that can occur in natural selection is when a very extreme environmental change takes place. Sometimes an environmental change can take place that is far too extreme for the species to have time to adapt to. In that case, this can lead to entire species going extinct. You can think of the example of the Ice Age in this case. In that case, the environmental change that took place was too extreme, causing too much of a change for that species to appropriately adapt to over time, and leading to several different species going extinct.